Hey everyone, welcome back to Project Honesty, a podcast designed for young adults, by a young adult, to gain brutally honest, friend-like advice, as well as provide a platform for young adults to form opinions, color outside of the lines, take deep dives into current events, and most importantly, have fun. This is Project Honesty, navigating reality with real conversations and diverse opinions. Hey, I am so happy to have you all back for another episode of Project Honesty. If you listened to last week's episode about the homelessness crisis, you would know that I dropped a little bit of a hint about what we're going to be doing today, and I guess for the next 3 weeks. Today's episode is going to start a 3-part series, with this being the first, of Indigenous issues in Canada. Specifically today, we're going to be discussing the Indian Act and anti-Indigenous legislation throughout history and how that has an impact on society and Indigenous people today. Why is this important? The amount of work we've put towards truth and reconciliation within the last decade has been incredible and fantastic, but we still have so far to go. And as someone who's a little bit of a nerd about this stuff and have taken courses at the 10 and the 20 level in Indigenous studies, I find the topic interesting. Another thing that I will be doing today, and that should be known as a fact moving forward in this podcasting journey, is recognition that the land that this podcast was created on and is recorded on, edited, and posted on is treaty land. I specifically am on Treaty 7 land, which is a treaty in Canada, but I think it stretches into Montana a little bit. I'm not too sure. There is a map available online. If you look up Indigenous treaty map, you can see all of the different treaties across the world, I think. It's super cool to see. It's so interesting. I love looking at that map. I wish I could put the link in, but it won't let me. Trust me, I've tried. It doesn't work. I'm sorry. But before I start off, I just want to say that if you don't know what treaty you're in right now, or what region you're in, I highly encourage you to go take a look. As a person who isn't Indigenous, and just people in general, whether you're Indigenous or not, we have to recognize that we are on treaty land. Again, as a non-Indigenous person, I want to use my privilege to promote cultural inclusion and the recognition that I wasn't here first. This is not my land. I live and work and play on stolen land, unfortunately. And so it is my duty as a person who exists to fight for action within truth and reconciliation. In this episode, you will hear me, and I guess throughout the series, you'll hear me use the word Indian. That is only because I will be reading stuff from old legislation, so I am reading it based on how it is written. I don't want to change that legislation when I'm reading it because it is a fact, and I want to read it the way it exists. I just want to let you guys know that Indian, Native, and Aboriginal are very outdated terms to refer to Indigenous people. Indigenous is the word that is most commonly used and most commonly accepted and is more inclusive of Indigenous communities and people. Just a little bit of a trigger warning. This series contains conversations around genocide, substance abuse, generational trauma, assimilation, and racism. I am not going to avoid those subjects. They're important subjects to talk about and recognize. So if they make you uncomfortable, I am very sorry. I recommend not listening, but I think it's important to have conversations around these topics because they happened and we need to recognize that they happened. So to kind of start this episode around anti-Indigenous legislation and the Indian Act, we're going to be talking about what the Indian Act even is. Now, if you're in Canada, you probably have heard of the Indian Act. Maybe you've read a little bit about it. We're going to go over why we need to talk about it and how it has affected anti-Indigenous legislation that was also made in the past, and how it affects Indigenous populations in Canada currently. The Indian Act was one of the largest, if not the largest, assimilation policy ever implemented in Canada. It is colonial legislation, and it gave Canada's federal government power to control Indian status and Indigenous reservations. So the Indian Act was put into law on April 12th of 1876. And the ultimate goal of the Indian Act was to control and assimilate Indigenous people in Canada and convert them to a more Euro-Canadian lifestyle and way of thinking. Amendments have been made over the years to rid the Indian Act of its oppressive policies, but there's one problem. It still exists today. It still affects how people can gain status. So Indigenous people looking to gain status still have to go through the original process of getting it through the Indian Act. And we're going to get into what status is and how to gain status and all the confusing stuff in a minute. Since the Indian Act still exists, it has lasting influences on culture and politics. And I'm speaking about this specifically in Canada, and we're going to get into how it affects culture and politics specifically later on. Before the Indian Act, there was a document called the Royal Proclamation. Now, I've read most of the Royal Proclamation. It's like the most long thing you could ever read. I have done many projects on it. I have done a bunch of essays on it, and I've thoroughly studied the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And after a bunch of research, you kind of discover that the Royal Proclamation was the catalyst to the Indian Act of 1876. So we're going to also explore what the Royal Proclamation was and what it did for the Indian Act. We're going to get into status. I want to focus on status today because this is a part of the Indian Act that is genuinely confusing, but it also still impacts how people can gain status today. I will say that this section of the podcast is very hard to follow. Credits to Jairus of the Prairies on Instagram for making the process of understanding status easier. It's so difficult. Even when I learned it in Indigenous Studies 20, I was like, oh, what is happening? Because there is so much, and some of it doesn't make sense. I will say some of it's like, what? I will try my best to make it as easy to follow as possible. So when talking about status, you'll hear me refer to people called 6'1" and 6'2". So in Section 6 of the Indian Act, this is where people were categorized according to their status as status Indians. Both people with 6'1" or 6'2" status have full status. There is nothing such as half status. You either have status or you don't. Now, even throughout school and my research for this episode, I could not find the concrete definition for what a 6'1" or a 6'2" was. When I explain the chart of status, it'll kind of show you what that is, but at the same time, it's still confusing. So whether you're a 6'1" or 6'2", there are a number of factors that determine whether you were one or the other. And so we're going to get into what those factors may be. Again, this is going to be confusing. There's a lot of information here that doesn't make sense, but we're going to do it together, so it's okay. So there's 5 different ways to gain status in this chart. Jairus from the Prairies on Instagram, I just screenshotted his chart because I learned from this chart in school, and so I want to use it again because I think it was a very good chart. I'm going to try to link it. I don't know if it will work. If not, I will put in the description a way to Google this chart because I think it's easier once you look at it. We're going to go over this, okay? So starting off, if you are a 6'1" status Indian and you marry a 6'1" status person, your child will gain 6'1" status. Now, when I talk about status, it's written in like an equation form in this chart. So it is talking about kind of how your child more so gains status rather than you. So just think about yourself as the child, okay? 6'1" plus 6'1" equals 6'1" status. Moving on, we have 6'1" plus no status. So that could be a white person equals 6'2" status for that child. If you are a 6'1" status person and you marry a 6'2" status person, your child will get 6'1" status. To review those top 3, 6'1" plus 6'1" equals 6'1". 6'1 plus no status equals 6'2, and 6'1 plus 6'2 equals 6'1. So those are just the first three. There's two more. If you are 6'2 and you marry a 6'2, so 6'2 plus 6'2, your child will gain 6'1 status. If you are a 6'2 and you marry someone with no status, your child will be entitled to no status. So this may not make sense. And I understand that completely because sometimes it doesn't even make sense to me. And it's actually designed that way. It is made to be confusing. Some ways that you can lose status can include graduating university, joining the army, becoming a priest, and for women, they lost their Indian status by marrying someone who doesn't have Indian status. So if an Indigenous woman married a white man, she would lose her status and her kids would not be entitled to any level of status, no matter what level she was, even if she was a 6'1 or a 6'2. Again, this system is not designed to be easy to follow. It's actually kind of designed to trick you. When systems like the Indian Act, when policies like the Indian Act were enacted, they weren't thoroughly explained to Indigenous communities. Nobody knew what was happening, and this especially occurred when it came to treaty signing. I'll get into that, I think, either in the second episode or the third episode of this series. And so nobody really knew what was going on. But throughout the years of the Indian Act existing, we have figured out more about it and how to actually understand it and realized the problems with it being so confusing. With the confusing aspect of all of this legislation, when, say, for example, the Royal Proclamation was implemented, that was also never explained. It was only explained in English, first of all. So the Indigenous communities that were told to sign it, and the chiefs that were told to sign it, didn't understand anything on it. They were told to just put their signature down, and there you go. And so they were kind of left in the dark when it came to signing this. And that was the European settlers and the Canadian federal government taking advantage of their opportunity to lie, basically, and not give people the full understanding of what they're actually doing with this legislation, because now we know the consequences of this legislation and the negative impacts it has on Indigenous communities, yet we still have the Indian Act for some reason, which is insane. Earlier, I said we would get into a little bit about the Royal Proclamation. Basically, the Royal Proclamation was a promise of land, and it was the creation of the foundation for the relationship between the Crown rule of Britain and Indigenous communities in Canada and the negotiation of their land. This policy sparked many issues around Indigenous land claims and how the Crown interfered with Indigenous land and Indigenous land use. The Royal Proclamation doesn't seem like the worst piece of policy ever put in by the Canadian government or the Crown, because it left a legacy that was supposedly beneficial, but some are still very unhappy with it. A Canadian political advocate and politician, Sean Atleo, once described the Royal Proclamation as another empty promise made surrounding the land claims and conversations had between Indigenous communities and the Crown. He was not happy by the fact that the Royal Proclamation was created. There's actually an interview that I watched a couple months ago about him speaking about how the Royal Proclamation is basically bullshit. So it's a very interesting video. I wish I could link that too, but somehow it's not letting me put in links anymore, so love that for me. We kind of went over what the Indian Act was. There's so much to the Indian Act. I could talk about it for hours on end, but I won't because I don't have hours on end. And we went through what the Royal Proclamation was. So I want to address a law that was in the Indian Act before it was amended. It's called the Potlatch Law. Potlatch is Nootka Indian word meaning gift. The potlatch ceremonies happen in many different ways for many different Indigenous communities, but basically it's a ceremony where personal and traditional items and possessions are given away or destroyed in order to show wealth and power. So it's a very interesting traditional ceremony that is sacred, and it's a traditional practice of many Indigenous communities in Canada. What did this potlatch law outline? Again, under the Indian Act, so we already know it can't be good. A statement from the law says that every Indian or other person who engages in or assists in celebrating the Indian festival known as the potlatch or in the Indian dance Tumunana Was is guilty of a misdemeanor and shall be liable to imprisonment. Wow. Imprisonment for practicing and claiming your own culture. That is pretty disappointing to hear by the fact that that was once ever in Canadian legislation. That is disappointing. The potlatch law was a prime example of anti-Indigenous policies. And again, it has been amended. This law stopped Indigenous communities from practicing their sacred traditions, and it is unfortunate because that shouldn't happen. Nobody takes away our Canadian culture or any other culture that is practiced in Canada, so why did we ever take away the Indigenous culture that was once so lively in this country? It's very sad. That is just one of the other things about the Indian Act that is horrible. A good resource to learn more about the Indian Act, it's actually a book that I have. It's by Bob Joseph. I tagged him actually in the most recent post I made on Project Honesty's Instagram. It's called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. So I started reading it. I'm like a good chunk of the way through, and it's already so eye-opening, and the book addresses a lot of issues that the Indian Act has, and it's written so cleverly. Is that a word? Let's hope so. And it's a really good thing to check out if you want to learn more about the Indian Act. I think it's also available on Audible, so if you want to go listen to it on Audible, you can. So there were some specifics of the Indian Act and what it impacted when it came to culture and traditions and language. So now I want to go over some of the general things that the Indian Act has impacted and still is impacting, and what we know now about the Indian Act. So I split this up into 4 sections. So politics, Indigenous communities, treaty and land claims, and school. Kind of random categories, but all things I wanted to touch on. So when it comes to politics, the Indian Act has sparked a lot of conversations around truth and reconciliation. Canada now has a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this commission has outlined 94 calls to action to kind of make up for the mistakes that were made and still are being made in the Indian Act. There's also recently been conversations around why we're still using the status system that was outlined in the Indian Act today and why we haven't changed the policy around status and how to gain status. When it comes to Indigenous communities, I think we can all assume the negative impact that the Indian Act had on Indigenous communities. It caused so much generational trauma. There's not only mental scars, but there's physical scars. In later episodes, either the next one or the one after, I want to talk about residential schools, which is a really, really heavy topic that I couldn't really fit in properly into this episode, but I do want to talk about it. That is a way the Indian Act impacted the enforcement of residential schools in Canada, so we're going to get into that later. It also, with that generational trauma, there is obviously the substance abuse issues that come with that trauma and it not being handled properly. We're also going to get into that a little bit later. And I kind of touched on it in my last episode about homelessness, about substance abuse, but I didn't fully get into it, but I plan on getting into it. When it comes to treaties and land claims, we talked about the Royal Proclamation and how that kind of outlined the relationship between the British Crown and Indigenous people in Canada and the land that they supposedly share, even though it definitely wasn't shared, it was stolen. With the recognition that the Indian Act is a problem, when creating treaties and reservations and land claims, the Canadian federal government has done a really good job in involving Indigenous communities in those outlines when talking about treaties and reserves. Reviving land claims is another thing, giving back land and learning from it and helping in that restoration of the land that was lost for a very, very long time due to the Indian Act and the Royal Proclamation. Now, in school, I wouldn't have learned all this in school if I didn't take Indigenous Studies 10 and 20. That was a choice. I wanted to take it. So most of the stuff on here, some kids don't even know, which is unfortunate. I feel like this course is very important and isn't really built in properly into a social studies class, at least from my perspective. I don't know, people might get enough information in their social class, but I feel like it's not touched on enough in school. So with that, offering these Indigenous Studies courses in school, like I think my Indigenous Studies course for my school was written in 2019. So within the last 5 years, the fact that that was just done is kind of insane, but I'm going to try to get over that. Also, just having open conversations in an academic setting about the Indian Act and the consequences it has, because I feel like we don't talk about that in school enough. We learn about what the Indian Act is, but I feel like we could have gone more in depth with it, especially in earlier grades. The Indian Act played a big role in the creation of residential schools and the rules that they had in residential schools. To kind of end off this episode on a good and positive note, because these next 3 episodes will be quite heavy due to the subject matter and the heavy things that come along with talking about Indigenous issues in Canada, I will always end the episodes with what we can do. What can I do specifically as a non-Indigenous person to work towards truth and reconciliation? No matter who you are, whether you're Indigenous, whether you have status, whoever you are, okay? We all need to work towards truth and reconciliation. It only works if we all work. Now, truth and reconciliation doesn't have to come in big, crazy ideas. It can be small things. Small things make big impacts. Some of those things can include listening, hearing stories from elders, asking questions, and just challenging your overall bias when it comes to the subject of Indigenous issues in Canada, especially if you're of the older generation. I think it's important to challenge the things we've heard for the longest time and really take the time to carefully listen to what the Indigenous community has to say. Reading, whether that's a simple Instagram post or reading all 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's website. Reading and learning about the history and the impact of anti-Indigenous legislation on Indigenous communities is very important when it comes to truth and reconciliation, because you can only fight for what you know, right? You can only be passionate about what you know. So I think reading is definitely a part of that. So like, for example, reading the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, that is a good thing to read, and it's a great book, and it talks a lot about problems we have with the Indian Act and ways to move forward. Again, recognizing and researching whose land you're on. For me, again, Treaty 7, I think Region 3, if I'm sure. I have to go check that. But Treaty 7, Region 3. And just taking social action, making more people aware and getting more people involved in active efforts for truth and reconciliation are all ways to work towards truth and reconciliation, whether you are Indigenous or not. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Project Honesty. You can find Project Honesty on Spotify at Project Honesty or on YouTube at Project_Honesty. And to keep up to date with new episodes, you can head over to Project Honesty's Instagram, which is at Project_Honesty24, to help spread this podcast everywhere, tell a friend. Share with your family about Project Honesty and the stuff we do over here. You can direct them over to the Instagram or the Spotify or the YouTube for them to learn more, because the more listeners, the bigger the family. Thank you, and bye-bye.